Okay, it's a Friday night, and what better time than to do some book reviews? So I'm back at it. This is By Way of Deception: The Making and Unmaking of a Mossad Officer by Victor Ostrovsky. I think I'm saying that right, and Claire Hoy. This was published in. Hopefully, I still have the original receipt. Holy cow! This was originally published in 1990. So there's a follow-up book, I believe, called The Other Side of Deception, and I have that one as well, and I'll cover that one at another time when I sort through the rest of my books. But at any rate, so for the uninitiated, the Israeli Mossad. The Mossad is the equivalent of the CIA here in the United States. So what Ostrovsky tells in this book is his kind of tell-all story of becoming a Mossad officer, how he was recruited, how he was trained, the process of, kind of the finer points of being trained as a Mossad spy or operator or however they call it, and how he recruited assets in other countries. And that's especially interesting because a lot of the Mossad's work, it's done all over the world, but especially in the Middle East. And especially with a lot of their work is done in countries that are not friendly with Israel at all, obviously. And a lot of their work is done compromising Arab businessmen to cooperate with the Mossad, who, and that whole process is a very icky, nasty process that he describes in detail about. Basically, they work as con men, conning these guys who are typically reputable businessmen to become assets for the Mossad through blackmail. And again, all described in detail. And he talks about several of the covert operations conducted by the Mossad, and there's times when you feel like he's being pretty forthright, and there's times when you think there's probably a whole lot that's being held back. So that part of the book is a little frustrating because you get the idea there's a lot of this that is, even though he's telling this from the perspective of allegedly a disgruntled Israeli spy who has left and is fed up with the Israeli Mossad. Even though he's telling it from that perspective, you get the idea that he's probably still protecting a lot. Some probably out of self-preservation, some out of respect for the trade or whatever. But it's important to note, and before I explain this next part of the book, that when I say that he is a spy for Israel, I think the word Israel carries with it a lot of baggage, and as a result, I think it's real important to break down the semantics there of what we're talking about. We're discussing Israel as the political nation state, and that's a really important distinction because Israel, as from a biblical perspective, is a totally different spiritual entity. And I think that's a really important distinction that has been deliberately blurred. And we'll get into that here in a minute. But that blurring of that has created a lot of problems in the contemporary understanding of what exactly Israel is. I personally am of the mind that Israel, the political entity, is a rogue state, is not a spiritual entity of any way, shape, or form. It is a rogue state that really needs to be reined in and possibly even be broken up because it is not there's nothing prophetic or there's no fulfilled prophecy or anything in the nation state of Israel. Other than the name Israel, it bears no resemblance whatsoever to the spiritual, biblical, Mosaic law Israel of the Bible. So anyway, I digress. But I say all that to introduce this next point, which I think is really important. Modern Zionism has hung a lot of weight on the idea that Israel, political Israel, is in fact an extension of biblical Israel. Now, as a result of that, a lot of Jewish people throughout the world, a lot of people who identify as Jewish, feel like their ultimate allegiance is defense of the nation state of Israel, because they believe that is in fact the biblical Mosaic Israel. And as a result, and one of the things he talks about in this is what's called Sionim. And Sionim is the plural of Cyan, I believe. And what that is in Hebrew is a Cyan is like a helper. And what he discusses in here, and this has incredibly troubling implications, is that Sionim are, for instance, if a Jewish doctor here in the United States could be recruited by the Israeli Mossad to be a Sionim, part of the Sionim. And what that would mean is if he was called upon to help a Mossad operative, he would do so without question and move on from there. So for instance, if a Mossad operative approaches a Jewish doctor with a gunshot wound, say that gunshot wound received in the line of duty or whatever, then that Jewish doctor, as a Sionim, would be required to patch up that gunshot wound, not report it, obviously, and send this guy on his way without incident, without report, to help out this Mossad operative. And another example that would be, let's say you're a Jewish car dealership owner, and a Mossad operative pops up on your lot one day. You might be more inclined to help that Mossad operative find his way into a vehicle without the usual paperwork required. In fact, you might even declare that vehicle having been stolen or something. So things like that. So let's say you're a Jewish pharmacy owner. You would be inclined to help out. You might just lose some narcotics or some painkillers or something, or whatever that was needed by that particular operative. Things like that. Now, the problem, though, with that is a lot of these Sionim, and I believe Ostrovsky even addresses this in this book, a lot of these people are very naive, and they feel like they've really been drawn into this noble cause when they do this. Their Jewishness is really being exploited by a state apparatus. So as a result, some of these Mossad operatives that are sometimes involved in organized criminal dealings and things like that might be using these connections for other purposes, and some of these covert operations might run completely counter to the nation's interests in which they are residing. So that, of course, creates all kinds of problems, because now you're casting suspicion on all of the Jewish business owners, because all of these doctors, lawyers, whoever, are potential operatives. And how far into that they are aware of that is another matter entirely. But either way, it would be like me as a Christian being required to aid in if the Vatican shows up on my doorstep and says, "Hey, we need X, Y, and Z," and I just got to help them without question. That would cast a lot of suspicion on Christians all across the world if they believe that, hey, you guys are, wherever you're at, you're a potential asset for the Vatican. And in fact, that's how a lot of Catholics were viewed that way up until relatively recently, was seen as a potential asset for Rome. So the fact that he's putting that out there, that that is in fact what the Sionim are, literally assets of the nation state, there is very problematic. But anyway, in closing, I think it's interesting to note that the by way of deception, that comes from the Mossad motto, is on their seal, it says, "By way of deception, thou shalt do war." And that is so much of the Israeli way, is deliberately targeting a group, purporting to be another group, or creating these attacks and these, in fact, he talks about even them at one point training rival groups that were fighting each other. That they're using all kinds of deceptive means in order to further their agenda. So, at any rate, this is a very very good book, not very difficult to find, but a really good insight into the workings of the Israeli Mossad. Now, like I said, there's some things in this that I believe he's telling the honest truth, and then there's other parts of this, and if you read it, you'll see what I'm saying. There's other parts of this, if you've studied any of the other material I've covered on this channel, there's some of the stuff that's going to jump out at you as like, yeah, buddy, you're not being 100% truthful. But again, I think a lot of that, given his whole turncoat thing that he went through, I think some of that is probably self-preservation more than anything else. So anyway, By Way of Deception by Victor Ostrovsky and Claire Hoy. Claire Hoy, I believe, was a Canadian political writer that co-authored this with him. So, and this is, of course, from 1990.